Okay, hello. In this chapter, I'm going to be explaining all the different ways I know how to light up my characters and add lighting into my illustrations. So, there are three main ways I know that highlight the character the most and just enforce their silhouette in the illustration. You want to make sure you have some very good lighting in your illustration because that's how you make it eye catching and you make the characters stand out, whether it be from the background or whether you aren't zoomed in on the illustration. You want to make sure that all your shapes are readable and they just have this sort of realistic element to them. When you place your character in a 3D space, of course, you want to add some interesting lighting to the character. So let's just get into the three ways I know how to light up a character. If we look at option number one here, over here, it says dynamic lighting. So let me just zoom in here. Dynamic lighting. So if you read there, it says interesting lighting shapes. Character has a 20 to 50% to 20 to 50% lighting to shadow ratio, and highlights are made in the middle of shadow forms. So basically, with this type of lighting, you have the really striking and prominent dynamic lighting that you have when you put majority of your character in this strong lighting. So that's why I said you normally have a 50% to 50% shadow ratio because you almost have an equal amount of shadow versus your strong lighting. So that's why if you want to have the most striking lighting, you should go for this option. That way you can create some really interesting lighting shapes. So if your character doesn't have the most interesting design or the most interesting shapes within the design, then I recommend using this type of lighting. That way you get to play around with the shapes of the light onto the character, and that way that's how you can add those interesting shapes to a character that doesn't have interesting shapes or design elements in the first place. So, what I meant by highlights are made in the middle of form shadows, when you're depicting the overall forms and the overall lighting in the early stages of the illustration, you just want to make sure that your character doesn't end up looking flat once you've added those lighting shapes. Of course, yes, the lighting is meant to make sure that your characters look as if they have that 3D form. But when you're placing those ambient lights or those highlights that show the different material depictions. For example, you're adding that shiny highlights to your gold, but your gold has the lighting of the scene, whether it be from the direct sunlight or some other artificial lighting. You still want to make sure that those other highlights that you've added to the material within the middle of those shadow shapes. That way you can get the most out of your 3D forms when it comes to adding your shadows and adding your gradients and all the different types of materials you will depict. So I want to take it into a painted example. You can see over here, I already have a character ready. And when it comes to when you should be adding your lighting, for most of my illustrations, I tend to add the lighting once I've done the color blocking and the environmental colors. That's when I'll go in and add my lighting. Then I can make sure I have the overall look of the illustration down before I go into rendering and cleaning up my shapes. So here I'm just going to make a new layer, set it to clipping mask because before I add any lighting, I want to make sure I already have enough contrast in my shadows. So with a lot of things, I first like to go with the multiply layer and just graze the character with a sort of saturated tone, just to make sure that our shadows will end up having some color as well and not everything looks gray in the end. Then I'd add a new layer, set it to clipping, and for this layer I could either go with a normal layer. That way I can adjust my colors manually, or I can first go in with a screen color, and then afterwards I will sort of merge everything down and then adjust the colors on top. Because when it comes to lighting, whatever you're lighting, not all the colors look the same. If you're lighting things with different colors, they will take on different colors in the lighting. So now that we have our screen layer, we get to experiment with what direction and how strong we want the lighting to be. So for this type of lighting, I'm just going to go pretty roughly and just paint on some lighting. I, Actually, I think I want to go from the other side here. So I'm sort of treating everything as if all the flames, all the sorry, if all the parts are in equal parts lighting and shadow. But of course, that's not gonna be the case when you're lighting 3D forms. You have to pay attention to the silhouette as well as what exactly you are lighting. So that's why it's good to have a full canvas view. That way you can easily see if you're making mistakes and adjust it at the same time. So here I am. I think we are in a good place and we can just experiment with how we want it to look. So don't pay attention too much to staying within your lines. You just want to make sure that whatever you're lighting, it ends up being readable as well as interesting. So I'm just going to treat everything as if the light source is coming from the same direction. Of course, nothing has to be realistic. If you feel that it ends up looking good as well as framing your character nicely, then that's the main thing. You just want to make sure things look readable. Okay, I think we can add a little bit here. Okay, that's why I felt as if the colors weren't looking as they should. That's because I was on a normal layer all the time when I should have been on a screen layer. So when it comes to the layer modes you can use for your lighting, I tend to use the screen layer mode the most, but another one I can also use is, let me just see here, color dodge could also be pretty good for darker colors. But when it comes to stronger lighting, stick to screen. Hard light is also a good option, especially if you want your lighting to be pretty saturated. Linear light gives almost the same effect, a pretty good effect. I think we should go with that option. And just experiment with all the layer modes because each one gives its own different vibe. So let's just stick to linear light for now and continue with adding our lighting. Pay attention to cast shadows because with this type of lighting, cast shadows can be your best friend, and make sure you have those interesting shapes that make the lighting look more readable and believable. Also pay attention to when you are lighting shapes with a curve, they end up fading out in almost a blended shape. So make sure you add that blending when necessary. So over here, but when it comes to cast shadows, you want to keep the shapes pretty sharp. And as always, reference is your best friend. If you don't know which ways you can light your character to make them look interesting, then I suggest studying a lot of different photography, portrait photography, as well as, fashion models or fashion magazines. Those also tend to have pretty good lighting examples.